The webinar has started.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the May 11th regularly scheduled meeting of the KCRHA's Implementation Board. Today we're going to ask our former board chair, Nate Caminos, and current board member, to provide us with a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Chair. Ready? The King County Regional Homelessness Authority exists on Indigenous land. We acknowledge the ancestral homelands of those who walked here before us and those who still walk here, keeping in mind the integrity of this territory where Native peoples identify as the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, and Puyallup, as well as the tribes of the Muckleshoot, Tulalip, and other coastal Salish peoples and their descendants. We are grateful to their respectfully live and work as guests on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. This land acknowledgement is one small act in the ongoing process of working and being in good relationship with the land and the people of this land.
Hey, thank you for that. Really appreciate it. And for everyone, both on the board and in the public, I apologize, I forgot to mention that we are conducting this meeting via Zoom and that we're going to have all attendees muted until the public comment period. Please note that this meeting is recorded. All visual, verbal, and written comments will be part of the public record. Board members, to ask questions or share comments, please raise your hand by clicking the button on the right side, and we'll make sure that it's been entered into the queue. Now, let's go and get started. Naomi, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Carrie Anderson. Nate Caminos.
Here.
Paulo Carvalho. John Chalmanack.
Here.
Gordon McHenry.
Here.
Harold Odom. Damian Patnaw.
Here.
Adrian Quinn.
Here.
Michael Ramos.
Here.
Sarah Rankin.
Here.
Simha Reddy.
Here.
Juanita Spotted Elk.
Olive Green here as an alternate for Juanita Spotted Elk.
Chair, we do have quorum with 9 members present.
And thank you for being here, Lamont. So we will have 10 minutes for public comment, starting here just at 2:15. If you'd like to provide verbal comments, please go and type your name and the city you're from into the chat. It's now open and it will remain open until public comment section of the agenda is closed. In addition, you may use the chat directly to provide written comment from now until that public comment section of the agenda closes. Let's see, we have one person signed up, Bill Curlin Hackett, Shane Colston, wonderful. We're excited to hear from the public, so anyone who's interested in sharing your thoughts with us, please go ahead and sign up in public comment or just share your thoughts directly.
Bill, at this time, you should be unmuted.
Oh, there I go. Okay, ready. Are you able to hear me? I'm still not sure.
We sure are, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you for that nod, Sarah. Recent PowerPoint that we presented one of our last meetings. I just want to let you know the vehicle residency work group, we're not where that PowerPoint is. In fact, we're in a much more complex position. Number 2, severe weather updates are going out again, and I saw a presentation in East King. It looks better all the way across the board, except it still excludes vehicle residents. Number 3, the RFP that went out for safe lots is not really the work product of the vehicle residency work group per se. It was written by the staff, and we've really not had any part of it even to review the document before it went out. So I think there's a lot of frustration on the vehicle residency work group. And then the last thing is I'm working on finding out why the Salvation Army is getting money to do vehicle residency outreach in King County through the King County DCHS, and they're not part of RHA. And I am talking to Salvation Army today to find out their side of what they're doing. And I've directed a comment to Claudia Balducci, who's on the governing committee, King County Council Chair, why it's not under the RHA, because I really believe that we need consistent and collegial work. If we're going to address vehicle residency, we can't be funded by different jurisdictions going in different directions with different projects and outcomes. So that I'll leave it there, but I just want to say that vehicle residency is still being underfunded. It is chaos. We are getting vehicle residents shot at with both guns and BB guns. We're seeing more NIMBY blocks put up, and we're still trying to meet with Deputy Mayor Washington in the mayor's office of Seattle, and that is not happening. It seems to be between RHA and the deputy mayor, and we are being hampered enormously by this inability to meet and talk about how laws are not being enforced and or capriciously. So thanks.
So I was trying to thank you, Bill, for your comments about vehicle residents. Next up, I believe we have Shani Colston of our Continuum of Care, who's co-chair of our Continuum of Care Board and Advisory Committee. Shani, if you'd like to share your thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Good morning, afternoon. So today I'm here according to your guys' rules that I have to speak on regards to what the agenda is today. Your guys' agenda says that it's the budget proposal presentation and discussion with Meg Barclay and Mark Dones. And so yesterday it has become as a public knowledge to myself and others here in the community of King County that Mark was wholeheartedly able to secure a volunteer to do the point in time count this year. And I'm asking the board, and your responsibilities is oversight of his authority in that. And also going over that budget plan, if there's any more ideas to approve volunteers to do point in time counts, especially when they're white males, and no other assessments of guidance, right? Whether it was HMIS or past other entities and things that have done that research themselves, the experts, the people themselves were involved in, and how you guys can investigate that, right? Like, I want to know how that happens. I want to know how some white guy with a PhD gets to go out and count my people and then tell me that there's certain hubs spread out across where I wasn't even informed as a public person, much less as a professional in the field and an expert in the room and everywhere I sat. And so I'm really looking to hold people accountable for this, as well as the continued sweeps. We've had more sweeps now than Jenny Durkin has, and it's literally killing people, right? And this is what my people are telling me from the ground. I work in the front line. I live the life, right? I've been homeless within this time. And so I'm just looking for the implementation board to kind of help figure out what happened here and how we cannot have that happen again. That's all.
Thank you for that. No, really appreciate it. And I think today during our presentation, we're going to have a chance to hear a little bit about the point in time count, and hopefully that will answer some of our questions at least.
Thank you.
All right. And next up, we have Allison Eisinger of the Seattle-King County Coalition on Homelessness. Allison?
Thank you, Simha. Good afternoon to the folks whom I can see on my screen, and to those who are, like me, blindly zooming in with you all. For the record, I'm Allison Eisinger with the Seattle-King County Coalition on Homelessness. I appreciate, Shani, your comments, and I think we never want to talk in public about what is going on with people experiencing unsheltered homelessness without recognizing the extraordinary harm and ineffectiveness and costliness of sweeping people in the middle of both a homelessness and a public health emergency. But that's not actually why I raised my hand to speak. I wanted to just speak. I, like many others, am absorbing the budget details that have now been shared. And I wanted to specifically focus on an issue that really is critical to our collective ability to do the work that we are currently attempting to do and to do it better, as well as to expand. And that is investments in the workforce, the people who do the work every day and every night, outreach workers, people who keep shelter doors open, people who staff behavioral health crisis response and homeless housing PSH staff. I really appreciate that there's been a lot of focus through the RHA on the need to raise wages for providers. This is a need that is across the sector and it's crucial. And I really want to just share these comments because I think this body, as well as King County and Seattle electeds, will need to significantly increase just to hold steady. And we need to look at increasing the funding that's available for the agencies doing the work to meet their increased costs, as well as for the staff members. And we need to do that by looking at every single funding source, current and new. So we are certainly pleased to continue to work on that. And I appreciate that part of the budget proposal that you all are engaged in discussing. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Allison. And do we have anyone else, Naomi, who's signed up for public comment?
At this time, I do not see anybody else. Unless Shanae, I see your hand up. Is that for your previous comment, or would you like to make another comment? It looks like their hand went down.
Well, appreciate that. Moving on to the next item in our agenda then, public comment is now closed. A couple just housekeeping items. We're going to take a moment and I'm going to ask you to approve the March meeting minutes. We do not have the April meeting minutes for your review today, but if you were at the March meeting, I would appreciate is there anyone here who would be sorry, I keep forgetting the language, but
motion to adopt.
Thank you, Mark. The word motion had completely slipped my mind. Do we have a motion to approve the March meeting minutes?
So moved.
And do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Damien. We'll do this by voice vote. All those in favor, say aye.
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 All those opposed? Any abstentions?
I was unable to attend that meeting, so I'll have to abstain.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, the March meeting minutes are approved. Moving on to the next section of our agenda. Today, the focus of today's meeting is entirely on our budget. Today, we are going to have an opportunity to hear from KCRHA's Chief Administrative Officer, Meg Barclay, and our CEO, Mark Doans, as they share the proposal for the 2023 draft budget. Just a reminder both to the public and for ourselves that we are not voting on this budget proposal today. Today is a day for discussion and review, and we will be returning on May 24th, I believe. Let me double check. May 24th at noon for a special meeting for a vote on this budget proposal. All right, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Meg and Mark. Thank you. And actually, before we get started, Mark, Meg, how would you like to have questions as you progress, or would you like to have them saved till the end or in the chat?
Given the volume of material, Chair, I think it would be best for folks to, well, now I'm torn. I think people should just dive in.
Okay,
it's
wonderful.
a lot of material, and you know, I don't want folks to, you know, wait 50 slides to ask a question about slide 2. Mark Doans, they then pronouns CEO of the authority, and Meg, if you would be so kind as to read yourself into the record.
Hi, I'm Meg Barclay, she, her pronouns, and I'm the Chief Administrative Officer of KCRJ.
And I will share my screen. So thank you all for your time today. This budget proposal is, there's no vote today. This is deliberative. This is your opportunity to weigh in, ask questions, tell us we're wrong about stuff, whatever is appropriate. We have been working steadily with Damien and the rest of the budget committee over the last several weeks on this proposal. And I'm wondering, actually, before we begin, if there's anything, Damien, Nate, Simha, that you would like to say about this proposal before we dive into it.
No, Mark, I just really want to thank you and your team for, one, creating the space and time and opportunity for us to meet and answering our questions, and the back and forth has been very, very positive. And I would say that obviously the process will continue to play out, but at this point in time, I'm very pleased with where we're at.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Nothing on my end. Thanks, Mark. And in addition to what Damien said, has some thoughts just to kind of maybe round things out as we get towards the end of the presentation itself. But I think this is like our first subcommittee that's really launched since we established or we improved these a year ago. And I just see this as one example, as Damien mentioned, the great dialogue and coordination between our board and you and your staff, and the 4 other committees that we could also tackle on, but obviously being a key priority in the next few weeks. So, but no, thanks for all your time.
Awesome. So our agenda with this presentation for Meg and I is organizational updates, and that's quite brief. And then before we got into the budget, we felt like it was important to give you an update on what we know about the current system and what planning activities are underway. And so our first main 3 sections on data planning and current system analysis are really just to give you a deeper dive into what the authority team understands of our current system, where we see opportunities for improvement, et cetera. Some of those opportunities are better addressed or best addressed inside our 5-year planning work, and so are not taken up inside our FY23 budget, and some are. But wanted folks to make sure, or wanted rather to make sure that folks had that comprehensive view. Our 5th item is just a brief reminder of what the 22 budget is. And then item 6 and 7, the most important probably for certainly our public, are the proposed incremental changes. We've broken these out as priority incremental changes and then additional changes to consider. And then the full budget proposal lined up on a spreadsheet, and then we've got time for discussion. Because of the volume of material, I am going to speak at a relatively a good clip. And if folks are needing me to slow down or are trying to get in, please just jump in. So first, let's start with just organizational updates. So briefly, this complicated and a little bit messy slide outlines all of the work that we are doing and some other events around that work. So, when I was onboarded, contracting and finance system setup, internal infrastructure setup, contract transfer, up, which is our renamed point in time count, our budget, 5-year planning, system rebid, data infrastructure, HMIS setup, partnership for zero, phase 1, system advocate stand up, ombuds office, by name list, your board meetings, and then other reporting requirements. So this is all the activity that is happening at the agency. I don't think that we have ever really just lifted it up in this way. I also, because this goes back in time, we put And I also, just for the public, I don't know that there is a full appreciation of just how much of a startup this agency was, that I was, an employee of one for many weeks, that my first week was spent trying to figure out how to receive email, that we didn't switch off of public Wi-Fi until December. And then stepped right into a severe weather event and the Omicron surge. And so I say all that simply to say that I'm really proud of this team and proud of the work that they have been able to do inside this much activity and against the backdrop of the world as it is. A quick note on hiring. So we have hired 56 people over 13 months, and we have about 42 positions remaining, including 30 system advocates. Those are our grant-funded positions that will be focused on deploying a peer navigation model. Also, really, that's a lot of people. So I'm actually quite pleased with that as well. Okay, so moving into data, which will bridge us into the substance of our conversation today. So what we understand about the number of folks experiencing homelessness in King County is that it's roughly 45,000 people. We get to that number through an administrative data exercise conducted in partnership with our colleagues in the Performance Measurement and Evaluation Unit at the Department of Community and Human Services in King County, who were able to look at the folks enrolled in HMIS, the folks reported homeless in the BHERD data, and the folks reported homeless in the Healthcare for the Homeless Network data, and identified that there was a pretty significant what we call underlap between those data sets to the tune of almost about 8,000 people. Aggregated across those systems and then deduplicated, in 2019, they note that there were 45,300 people who experienced homelessness in the county, and in 2020, 40,800. What we have done for the purposes of our work in terms of thinking about how many people we need to serve is we have stuck with the 45,000 number. And the reason for that is that as we moved into 2020 and the pandemic really began to take hold, two key things happened. One, a number of spaces where people would have been identified as experiencing homelessness shuttered, right? So we closed a lot of day centers, for example. We de-intensified across the system in a number of ways, which was good, but it meant that we were able to see less people. Additionally, through eviction moratoria and other efforts, a lot of people stayed housed, right? As those things shift, both back to more baseline, we expect that this number will rise. So when we talk about who is experiencing homelessness in the county from a simply numerical value, this are the two most important numbers for us, and the 2019 number being the most important. Point in time count data, this just indexes, what we were just discussing against point in time count. So the yellow line at the bottom is the point in time count through 2020. And then this top line here is that aggregated data. For the 2022 point in time count results, what we have identified through a respondent-driven sampling method and then some statistical modeling is that roughly 7,800 people were experiencing unsheltered homelessness during the point in time count. That is an increase of roughly 38%. My understanding is that we have some continued analysis to do around some demographics in that data, and that there is, that we will likely want to do some additional sampling in subregions where we feel we may have undersampled from a qualitative perspective, meaning that we feel confident in the number, but not necessarily confident in the qualitative aspect in terms of all the stories that we heard. We also collected in partnership with a number of folks over 500 oral histories. That qualitative data will be analyzed over the next several months for incorporation into the 5-year plan. Demographically, it's important to note that structural racism continues to be a significant driver of homelessness, right? So we look at the county and see 6% of folks are Black or African-American, and 30% of the population experiencing homelessness identifies as Black. For our Native Indigenous folks, 1% of the county population identifies as Native, and 5% of the population experiencing homelessness identifies as Native. These are really, really significant increases from a factor perspective. A 5-fold increase is really troubling. And so one of the things that we want to be really clear about is that our work to end homelessness has to be not just coupled, but at its core has to be racial justice work. That means empowering communities to design and run their own programming. It means having very serious conversations about whether or not the metrics that are used are the correct metrics, right? That we talk about developing metrics in partnership with those communities and in partnership with the researchers that those communities turn to, rather than simply, entrenching the existing metrics. Much of this work in terms of the development of metrics and engaging in understanding how to fund differently, et cetera, is going to be part of our 5-year plan, which will come out in September. Just briefly, we note that there are also, Board Member Quinn.
Thanks, Mark. I wonder, thinking about Shawnee's comment earlier, I wonder if you could please talk more about community engagement, both in terms of development of the metrics and also development to the budget. So who else is involved in determining the metrics and who else has been involved in development of the budget?
Yeah, so on the metric side, we haven't yet really begun metric development. We have planned, so this Saturday, we have our first convening that'll start to tap into that. So we've got COC convening. I believe several hundred folks are registered at the last time that I checked. And there are a number of workshops. It's virtual, but there are a number of workshops planned over the course of the day. And some of them go explicitly at how do we measure what matters, looking at, appropriate power sharing, what does that look like? So that'll be our first significant engagement to intake that information. Over the course of the summer, we'll have a lot more of that and are currently architecting a number of different pathways, including some other regional convenings, some convenings of you all. If you haven't filled out the doodle poll, please fill out the doodle poll. And other folks are in community in order to understand that. For the budget itself, this, I'll be honest, this is not, and I mentioned this at the outset, or maybe I didn't, maybe I'm just blurring my conversations because it's been a long week. This budget will not be our transformational budget. And part of that is because it's not connected to our 5-year plan. And the 5-year plan is the thing that's truly going to be transformational. I think we take steps in the right direction here. And in that, we have been working closely with a number of different stakeholders, including some providers, LEC, et cetera. But I don't want to overstate this as being a super engaged process. And part of that has been the timeline that we were asked to develop it on. We have more time to develop the 5-year plan, which will have attached to it a 6-year budgeting cycle. And so that I will feel much more confident about in terms of, we talk to all the people, we feel good about what's in here, we feel like it funds the right stuff, and we're going to measure it in the right way. Was that responsive?
Thank you. Yes.
Continuing demographics, I will just say briefly, there is a difference in the characteristics of who only shows up in HMIS versus who shows up in Be Heard or Healthcare for the Homeless data. It is quite interesting, but we don't really know much about why. So there's not a lot to say here for shifting in program model, but it is, I think, a discussion that we are looking forward to having both with our colleagues at DCHS and in community. Okay, into planning activities. Pardon me, Meg, is there anything you wanted to add on data?
Yeah, you totally covered all of it. Thank you.
Okay, into planning activities. So we really think of ourselves in the 5-year plan creation as putting the top on a pyramid, right? So we have the NIS report, which lays out 10 transformational actions necessary in order to move the system to working. We have the regional action framework, which takes a lot of the NIS report and then translates it into objectives and metrics. The 5-year plan is really, the tip of the spear, so to speak, and is the implementation plan for the regional action framework to achieve the goals laid out in the NIS report. And I say this because I want to be really clear with Grace. We can't afford to just do a whole new plan from scratch. We have so many plans in our community. Many of them are really good. Our problem is that we don't do those plans. Like, that's actually our issue. And so the 5-year plan does not need to reinvent the wheel, right? And some of the, to board member Quinn's question, some of the community engagement that is really critical to good planning did happen, right? Inside the NIS work and inside the regional action framework development. Is there more to do? Yes, but it isn't starting from scratch. And that, I think, is the key factor, and why it feels doable in a summer, and why we're not saying, oh, we need a full 8 to 12 months in order to do the plan. We think that we can do the necessary engagement over the summer because it's about sub-regional engagement. It's about some key populations we want to make sure we touch base with to ensure that, again, there's a clear racial justice component about talking to the communities most impacted, et cetera. But we want to be very clear that this is not starting from baseline. How we see this working is that there are these existing community data sources. So the NIS report, the regional action framework, the data from UP, the community workshops that we'll be running, sub-regional engagement that Alexis and her team have been doing for over a year. Goals and priorities that flow into the 5-year plan will come from that body of work. Additionally, we will fold in the sub-regional planning activities, the 6-year budget, and a gaps analysis that we plan to conduct over the course of the summer as well. These then will give rise to overall system priorities and metrics and guidelines that will go into future contracts. And this is the part that I think is just really important to understand, is that what we believe is critical for future procurement to be successful and future measurement to be successful is that we all agree on where we're going, and that when we ask providers to be accountable to things, that's been part of a discussion, and we know transparently how we got there and why we are there. It's one of the reasons why we have not introduced a ton of new metrics or a ton of new reporting requirements into the contracts that have migrated from city and county. We haven't had those conversations. We don't all agree that those are the right things to measure. And in fact, where we mostly agree is how some of those things are the wrong things to measure. And so we need to construct the right metrics, and we need to do that as a community. Board Member Quinn.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate what you're saying, and I don't disagree with any of it. I feel like there's a little bit of a conflict, though, not in what you're saying, but in the process, in that we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and there is disagreement about some of the metrics in some of the existing documents or existing contracts. And so how do we have sufficient input from the public, from the providers, so that the metrics that are problematic are changed, but we're not reinventing the wheel? I think there's a fine line there.
I agree. I think that where we have done a lot of work historically is more in the like what's broken space. We haven't done as much work in the so what should we actually be measuring space. That is the part that I feel significantly less confident in, right? So picking outreach as an example, because it's one of the places where the measurements, I think we all agree, are kind of the most wacky. There's a lot of measurement around number of contacts and well, let's just use that example, number of contacts. That's a thing that has historically been measured. What we hear from people who are experiencing homelessness is that results in like sort of hassling behavior, right? Because outreach workers are being judged at the staff level for how many times did I talk to Adrian today, right? And you might be telling me, Mark, I don't need to talk to you anymore. I'm actually all set. But my performance is being graded literally on whether or not I come back and talk to you again. And so those kinds of things we're really clear on as that's the wrong thing to measure. But we haven't necessarily had a conversation then on, well, how do we measure the efficacy of outreach that gets us to a set of standards that we all agree on? I, for one, am really interested, and this is literally me riffing, so providers who are listening to this, please don't panic. This is the conversation we'll have. I, for one, am really interested in thinking about, can we institute more of a stages of change kind of measurement, right? Where we are literally looking at, are we working with people to go from pre-contemplation to contemplation to action, right? And that doesn't necessarily require that we measure the number of times you've talked to a person. It's about the quality and the outcome of that conversation. And that's a thing that I've been thinking a lot about. I've read a bunch of the papers on to see, is this possible? How do we do it? And now I feel like we need to talk about it as a community with the folks who do that work to hear, does this make sense? And would it be overly burdensome and how it yada, yada, yada. So it's the generative work in each subsection of the portfolio that I actually feel like has been missing. Is that helpful? Okay. Any other questions on this part? All right. So the framework of the regional action work, right, had 3 activities that provided the basis for regional alignment. And one was the implementation of the KCRHA. The second was the development of the external partners group, which is We Are In, helmed by our colleague Felicia. And the third was the framework itself. So just as a reminder of all of this work, again, I just want to remind folks we're not starting from zero. So these were the 10 transformative actions outlined in the NIS report. A system-wide theory of change, consolidating everything into a joint entity, that is the authority, centering the customer or centering folks with lived expertise, prioritizing economic stability as a core function of the work, a digital transformation to make moving data between things much more seamless, that has taken the shape of our BNL work, redesigning intake so that it's less invasive and a more of a progressive style of engaging people so that we're asking them the right questions at the right time, expanding health services. We have a senior director of health initiatives, a public-private partnership. Again, that's our We Are In work, increasing the rate of housing development. We don't do that, but we play a big advocacy role there, and institutional alignment. So really structuring the work that we do between the different bodies that have overlap rather than just sort of hanging everything on partnership and personality. This team that you see is the team that I was privileged to lead formerly, doing a lot of that work and analysis and looking at all the data and the inputs and turning it into that report, which is still available online if folks would like to see it. The 4 components of the regional action framework then look at the KCRHA and say, where do we have the highest degree of accountability, which is implementation, and where is our lowest degree of accountability, which is for advocacy. And what the framework then lands on is that we, the authority, are responsible for crisis response. That is what we are implementing. And so what you see in our budget and what you see in our activity is a focus on that crisis response work. We don't build housing, right? And while we advocate for it, while I can't go anywhere without saying we should just have more 0-30% AMI housing so that I don't have to do this job, that's not what we are charged with doing. So our work is really to ensure that the crisis response system hums, that that goal statement of homelessness is rare, brief, and one time is actually something that we can hang a hat on and say is actually really happening, and that is a process point to getting to we have ended homelessness. And that involves these other components around coordination, affordable and supportive housing, and then the mainstream systems and supports. So going into our current system analysis, this is how we take all that planning activity and then begin to take it into, so what do we see and where do we want to go? And these are very simplified. I'm going to show you some very simplified graphics of what we think the current system looks like versus where we want to go. I want to be clear, they are simplified. So again, if you're part of the public or a provider or someone and you're looking at this, you're like, well, I don't feel represented by this slide. That's okay. This slide is not designed to be as fully articulated as everything we understand about the system. But what we currently see is that we have a under-articulated system, meaning if you're experiencing unsheltered homelessness, the things that we put right in front of you are rapid rehousing or shelter, and that shelter then tends to translate into a permanent supportive housing placement. That tends to be the goal of the work, is to get folks into PSH, right? We have a less articulated vision of the various housing supports and strategies that folks need than what we are deploying. And this, I think, is the core of a lot of our difficulty, right? So, for example, much of what we hear from our provider community, both in the shelter space and the permanent supportive housing space, is that there's a lot of mismatch, right? There are folks who are showing up and they have needs that are deeper than what the shelter system or the permanent supportive housing system can meet, or in some cases are shallower, right? Like they don't actually need that permanent supportive housing as their in state. And by way of example, I dealt recently with a case where a person destabilized and had a psychotic break. This was on their way to shelter as a result of some other activity. And they subsequently assaulted shelter staff. They assaulted police officers who then came and then caused hundreds of thousands of dollars in damage by causing some flooding across a couple of rooms, right? The core here is that person shouldn't have been there. Like they had different needs than what that shelter was going to be able to meet. And so that's what we need to be having a conversation about, because no one is actually at fault in that scenario, right? The provider is not at fault. The person is not at fault. We just don't have the right stuff to line up with what people are showing up with. And so we need to start making that change. And so the conceptual model that we're working off of that's going to feed into our gaps analysis is looking at how unsheltered homelessness could then feed into options, right, of rapid rehousing, emergency housing, shelter, high acuity shelter, and that then there is some triaging, and that in accordance with where you are in your life and what's happening next for you, right, that the housing options and the various support options that you could access could be low acuity community living, PSH as is, recovery housing, harm reduction housing, long-term assisted living, right? And these might just be the basics. We might, again, need further articulation off of these or other ways to approach these as we further develop these kinds of program models. But just again, by way of example, over the course of my tenure, particularly with our folks who are living in vehicles, I've encountered so many seniors who just don't have a thing to go to, right? They don't need, PSH per se. Shelter is not for them. Rapid doesn't make sense because they're not going back to work. They're on fixed income. And so we really need to be thinking about how are we creating long-term assisted living options for them. In this space, I want to be really clear, particularly when we get to the housing space, the authority is not making the case that we should be the developer and the person who, or the agency rather, that runs all of that stuff. That's not my take. That's not our team's take. We think that those things may be stood up in partnership and that those partnerships have yet to be defined, but that's what we're looking to understand as we do our gaps analysis. How much of these things, how much should they cost? And then who are we partnering with to stand them up? As we continue with our current analysis of the existing system, what we also noted is that the costs in programming vary widely, right? So this slide shows you the highest cost we pay for a given program type and then the average cost. There's a reason we don't show the lowest cost, and it's basically because the things that are the lowest cost to us are often being subsidized heavily by other funding. And so it's an apples and oranges comparison. But suffice to say, emergency shelter, our highest cost, this is cost per bed per day. So our highest emergency service cost, our emergency shelter cost rather, is $213 per day, average is 70, tiny home 151, average 63, transitional housing 150, average 57. What this says to me is that we have no rates. There is no standardized rate across the different types of things that we operate. We don't necessarily have a way of saying, oh, you're setting up this thing, the rate for that type of bed is X, and here are the things we expect around it. Part of that has to do with the fund sources that have traditionally been in this space. They are not the same as, for example, Medicaid fund sources or other HHS fund sources that have federal regulatory rate making attached to them, or operate on significant reimbursement schemes that have rate making attached to them. Rather, they are some of the more flexible funds or a lot of local dollars, and there hasn't been rate making in that space. Meg, I know this is something you and I have talked about a lot, and I don't want to steal your thunder. Is there anything you would add here?
No, but I do think that that's going to be, I guess I would just add that that's going to be a big part of, as we're looking at the system going forward, is trying to establish what these services actually cost so that we can set a standard rate and make sure that that goes with the level of service that we want to see in those spaces. But I think we had a standard rate in LA, but it was too low. It wasn't at the actual cost. So it's not just meeting the rate, it's needing to understand what these programs actually cost or should cost.
Lamont?
For the emergency shelter, that also includes like the 24/7 type navigation centers. And so it includes all the forms of the different emergency shelters.
That's correct.
Okay.
So continuing our current analysis, we then dove more into each portfolio type. So looking at emergency shelter, what we see is that we fund about $54.9 million in that. The total funding that we can see by looking across all the program budgets, so this includes other forms of state, federal, private funding, et cetera, is it appears to be about $68.3 million countywide that is flowing into that type. This includes congregate and non-congregate. Not all of these facilities are open 24 hours. Some are first come, first serve. Some have limited capacity for belonging. Some have, expansive capacity. Again, there's wide variation in what is called emergency shelter here. And that's part of, to Meg's point, what standardization of this is going to have to look like. What are we calling each thing? Currently, what we see is that in 2021, there have been about 1,400 exits to permanent housing. The cost per exit looks to be about $60,000. The exit rate is only 19%, and the average length of stay is 112 days. Board Member Quinn.
Thanks, Mark. You mentioned standardization, and I do think that there needs to be a deeper understanding of the rates, but I'm wondering, if different shelters serve different populations.
Yep.
And that may be one of the variables in the rates. And so I think that you've already said that in a way because you said we don't have the right things, but I just think people need to be clear that there are different shelters that serve different populations, and maybe it's different rates for different types of shelters or different rates for different types of tiny home villages, et cetera.
I think that's right. And I think, for example, if we're running a high acuity space, that's a higher rate, because you're providing a higher density of service. If you're running a low acuity space, if you're thinking about, particularly culturally responsive services, right, that are, tailored for a community that has been underserved and is overrepresented. I think there's a lot of, I don't want people to get scared of rate making, right? That need not be like, the authority is going to come in and tell everybody it's $20 per bed per day, regardless of what we're trying to do. That's not our goal. Our goal is to understand what needs to happen and then create the appropriate structure around the reimbursement and the cost so that we really can say, this is what this costs to do. Lamont.
Lamont, how come I'm not called board member Green like board member?
I'm sorry,
Green?
board member
I'm
Green.
jealous. I'm just joking. I'm just being silly, Mark. So with bridge housing, is that under emergency shelter or transitional housing? Like the bridge housing, like Labatia?
That would be under transitional right now, I believe. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies, board member Green. It's because you're an alternate, and most of the time I just call you Lamont. My brain is not.
I'm really teasing Mark.
So for tiny house villages, we note that the KCRHA funding is about $7.9 million. Total funding appears to be about 8.1. We have 125 exits, $64,000 per exit. Exit rate is pretty high, right? So from all of our shelter types, this is the highest exit rate at 45%. Average length of stay is 339 days. This is one of our more expensive costs per exit based on our preliminary analysis. It has a very, again, long average length of stay. Average length of stay for folks who exit to permanent housing is longer at 561 days. These have shared bathrooms and cooking spaces and individual 96 square foot living spaces. What's important to note about tiny house villages, and what I think is really important for the overall conversation, is that up until very recently, these were our only non-congregate option, which is why I believe that they have produced higher rates and why I believe that they have produced to some degree longer stays, right? Like people have been stabilizing in some of these spaces. I think we need to take a deeper dive there. And I certainly want to be clear, these lengths of stay are something that I've been clear about from the beginning. We need to dig into, understand, again, is this the right metric? I also think that, like, broadly speaking, under the authority's direction, we're going to just be moving full scale in the direction of non-congregate space, right? We want more non-congregate space, more dignity-based space, space that is safer for COVID, which is, kind of never going to be over, right? And so that's just the direction that the system is going to take. And we're interested in exploring a number of ways to get there. Board member McHenry.
I'm going to be like Lamont. You can just call me Gordon. I'm appreciating, and this is a good grounding in the current realities for the regional authority. And I'm thinking about the 5-year, and I was thinking about your chart that says, we advocate, we don't build or create affordable housing. But then, of course, the metrics that talk about average length of stay and moving into, permanent housing with or without support are dependent upon affordable housing.
That's right.
Or affordable housing with services. More non-congregate places for folks coming out of unsheltered homelessness before they get into longer term affordable housing with or without services also is dependent upon things outside of our control. Right. So I think as we get into this 5-year plan, it won't be fixed, but there's going to be certain assumptions that we're making as to the amount and accessibility of affordable housing and how that relates back to the type of emergency response the regional authority can be responsible for and held accountable for. So I think it's going to create a very interesting conversation. I hopefully will see that those assumptions are wrong over time in the sense of getting better. But of course, the downside is we could be wrong and they could get worse because NIMBYism, access to capital, supply, whatever, there's not enough affordable housing. And so I think there probably is a role for us as implementation board members, folks on this, in this Zoom call, to understand the criticality of that to making progress over 5 years, lest we find ourselves still having really challenging situations, or people saying, yeah, the best I can get, better than the street, is a tiny home. And yeah, I'm going to stay there for 300 and 400 days because the system doesn't provide me with a viable option.
Yep, that's right.
Okay.
And I, you know, I think that like, you know, I was speaking with someone in the media earlier, and I was like, you know, what we don't want is to become, and I say this with grace for my colleagues who run that system, we don't want to be New York. We don't want to have $1 billion shelter system and no housing, right? And so the time is right now to decide that that's not the road we're going to walk, because there is a path where we just funnel money into the homelessness crisis response system as the place to put all the money. And the result is, you know, the ever expanding emergency room and no actual hospital bed, right? So we have to figure out now as a community how we're going to prioritize the rapid construction of 0 to 30% AMI housing. And to your point, board member, at all levels of support. Not everyone needs supportive services. And that's another reason why I wanted to be clear that like just producing PSH, permanent supportive housing, is not the way to go from a population segmentation and need perspective. Board member Quinn.
Thanks, Mark. I'm with Lamont and Gordon. Adrian's great. Thank you, CEO Dones. One of the things, you know, we're talking about a five-year plan, which is critically important. And I'm also thinking about the need for community engagement, implementation board engagement now, because we have the renewal of the Seattle Housing Levy this coming year, as well as the renewal of the King County Vets, Seniors, and Human Services Levy, which the renewals of those won't happen within 5 years. And so to some degree, we need to expedite the community process and get buy-in so that what is needed in this community are reflected in those two funding sources. Yeah. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that and how we do it.
You know, so the authority has a policy which I think doesn't count in this. Like, so we don't typically comment on things on ballots, but I think our advocacy role that's in our legislation overrides that policy. So yes, we have to renew those levies, and we have to have community buy-in. And what I'm trying to do, you know, even through this presentation, is, you know, help people and the public understand what is actually happening in the existing system, right? And to really get people to understand that, like, we are actually doing, to your point, really well with what we've got. And that, like, if we don't produce more affordable housing, and if we don't differentiate the paths that you can take to get to it, that's going to be the thing that our community can't actually abide, right? And so much of my time and my team's time is spent having, you know, these small community conversations in an attempt to solicit input, to get feedback. You know, I go to Rotary clubs, I do the community meetings, and I really do think that, you know, and I appreciate what I think I heard as an offer, which is like, you know, if the board is interested, you know, we can have that be part of our conversation over the summer, or even over the remainder of the month, about how you all can tap into, you know, evangelizing and you know, helping to run the workshops, and because like it's a lot of work, and we are strapped. We are asking for more operating money in our budget. And I think that, like, you know, just the more that it is clear that this is a whole of community conversation and it is a whole of community response, the more likely we are to get buy-in, not just on those levies, but on the 5-year plan and the implications of that plan. I'm going to move forward. I'm not seeing other hands. So briefly, transitional housing. 3.2 million that we fund, 7.8 million total in that portfolio, 528 exits to permanent housing, $23,000 per exit, 66% exit rate, and an average length of stay is 326 days. It's the lowest cost per exit based on what we can see. Transitional housing does still operate under the 2-year maximum stay as a program model, and there's limited public funding available for this model because of a whole lot of decisions we made at the federal level around prioritizing housing first and non-time limited stays. Lastly, rapid rehousing, we've got 23.4 million in KCRHA funding, 25 million overall, about 1,200 exits, about $44,000 per exit, highest exit rate at 73%, and an average length of stay, in this case, average length of subsidy at 376 days. This is where I think, it's a market, and this is on the slide, this is a market dependent solution, right? And so, the challenge with locating housing units within program payment standards at scale is the big challenge here. And we may have hit it based on what we're currently doing. And Lamont and I have had conversation with the LEC and other really critical stakeholders around, what we might do to lengthen the subsidy to, is it longer and shallower? Is it longer and at the same depth? But like, there's market dynamics that have constrained us from going beyond where we are currently at in terms of efficacy here. And so there is some work to be done in terms of imagining the next step in what is a very effective model. Lamont, is there anything you would add there? Yep, there. I thought so.
No, I think that this one is so important, and they've been having a lot of discussions at the national level too with HUD, trying to get a lot of information out to communities, because we don't normally see rapid rehousing as a solution for chronically homeless populations.
That's right.
And rapid rehousing can be used for chronically homeless populations because you move people right into a unit, you can provide the wraparound and other supports they need, and rapid rehousing can be up to 24 months. They don't lose their chronically homeless status. And so then when a permanent supportive housing unit becomes available, you could move them into the permanent supportive housing. And so I think that we need to explore more that rapid rehousing is also a suitable intervention for all populations. And even though we have, a housing crisis, our vacancy rates, I think, pre-COVID are actually higher than they were before COVID, right? And so I think opportunity there to when we look at the market.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tight market, but I think there's opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Cross comparison across all program types, simplified program types. I'll just say, our exit rate to permanent housing is about 40%, which is honestly, it's not that bad. It's not amazing. Like we want to trend more towards 70. But as far as system dynamics go that I've seen across the country in the many, many years I've been doing this work, this is actually not terrible. And I think we should just always remind ourselves that we are not running a awful system where no one knows how to do their job. That narrative is out there and it is destructive. And so we do need to push back on it every chance we get. Average length of stay is about 257 days across all types. And again, that is also not terrible, right? There are some quirks, there are some things that are a little long, but I just think it's important always to say hey, we want to do better, but we cannot allow doing better to come at the cost of denigrating the providers who do this work every day. Somehow.
Mark, I think this is something that you've already said. I just wanted to emphasize it again, that when people look at this slide, I think there's some folks who are going to look at it and say, just based on these metrics, this is the right solution, or that is the wrong solution, right? That they're going to overvalue this metric of percentage of people who go on likelihood of exiting or cost of exit or time to exit. But there's such tremendous variation, and I loved how you talked about how what this tells us is that we need to find out more, right? There's so much variation within these types and such. Like a program, which programs take, who does a program take, for example, right? Someone difficult to house or not someone difficult to house. Are they part of an organization that's vertically integrated, right? That has its own permanent supportive housing and easy pathways in. Like all of these play a big role. And so something I think you've said time and again is that these are all potential good solutions for people. Like, and keeping a wide portfolio is important. Anyway.
Well, and I would just underline that too, because I think, you know, and they may not always tell us what we think they tell us, right? Because you see how, like the KCRHA funding that goes into transitional housing, it looks like we're leveraging a whole bunch of other money, but that's just because there's no public money for transitional housing anymore. So it's not actually like a public funding efficient solution. It's just, you're right. Like what these things tell us, the volatility really tells us that we need to know more about these things and what is an actual measure of effectiveness.
That's right. Rounding out again what we know about the current system before we go into our budget conversation, our FY23 budget conversation, is so about 5 agencies receive 47% of funding currently, which I find a little unnerving from a like, what happens if kind of perspective, to be honest. We also want to note, right, that like, again, provider workforce and capacity is extremely limited. And you heard Allison Eisinger offer comment about that, but you know, we've got 8.5% inflation this year. And across those 5 agencies, I looked at them earlier this week, 300 vacant positions. Like that's slow motion collapse stuff. And we should treat it as such. Like it is really, really bad. We just, like, I can't say it loudly enough that like, it's really bad. And the only way to get to a more stable place is gonna be through wages and helping to shore up the pipeline, right? And on that note, I will just note that our analysis indicates that provider wages are utterly unsustainable. So we have the King County median income. This is hourly, $49 per hour. Wage needed to afford a 1-bedroom apartment averages at $42 per hour. The wage considered low income is $39 per hour. And then we have our provider wages as we see them in our grants system, right? $24.92 an hour for case managers and $19.70 often for frontline staff, right? So these are just not sustainable wages. And we have to be very clear and very purposeful in identifying pathways to right size the system. We are not able to, in addition to all the other incremental ads, we have a provider wage ad. It will not take the entire system to living wages. It's a step in the direction, but we have to be on a path to getting there. And I just wanted the board and the public to be aware of this data as we consider that incremental change and others. Okay. So a really quick recap of the 22 budget, just so folks remember what we're currently operating with. So we have a $170 million approved budget, $118 million was base. We received $40 million that is in new program or sort of other funding, which includes one-time COVID funding and City of Seattle council budget ads. And then we have an $11 million operating budget, or 7% of the total budget. Also want to flag that we have HUD Continuum of Care as part of the system, right? So that's $52 million. KCRHA currently administers $11 million there. 37 million still sits at King County and will be transitioning in a phased way over to us. So all of this will be here. We are also the Continuum of Care lead agency. But the transition of all those contracts is underway. Adrienne.
Thanks, Mark. I know I've been asking a lot of questions. I feel like it's important for the implementation board to know is what the components of the base are. And obviously every budget is a policy document, and we're going to be talking about what needs to change. And so it'll be helpful to understand what some of those trade-offs are and
Yep.
where we're expanding and maybe what needs to be completely changed.
Yep. We do have a slide in the budget section that gets into that. And if it doesn't answer all your questions, please let me know.
And we will provide, I think, to your suggestion offline, Adrian, as well, the programs that were funded in the base last year and what we expect to continue this year as well in the presentation that you get with the final budget proposal, just so that I think this is really focused on the incremental changes, but the final budget proposal will have that detail on the base as well.
Thanks. I think that'll be really important for our decision making, because it's not just the incremental change that we should be talking about, it's the whole system and understanding better what the authority's vision is for the whole system and allowing the implementation board members to participate in that too.
Yes. Thank you. So now we are at the proposed incremental changes. The basis for our additional requests were identifying gaps in current services, ongoing effects of COVID-19, and that like we really don't have enough staff to do all the things like we're being asked to do. Again, none of this is final. This is like your opportunity to tell us like, do this, don't do this. Like we worked on it with the budget committee for several weeks. But this is not, this is not a like done deal. Okay. So the proposed incremental changes are broken into priority and additional changes for consideration. Priority changes are essentially adding places for people, right? Like that's what we're very focused on, is like more places for people to be. We are requesting $5 million for additional expansion of safe parking, or people experiencing homelessness with vehicles broadly. That could take the shape of some other services. 15 million for daytime community space. This takes the place of our sort of day and hygiene center. Sort of in looking across that program type, have identified that it's not, because of funding, it's not an enriched environment, right? Like the ability for service connection, the ability to provide people with access to other kinds of supportive connection is not what it could be. And so this 15 million is to enhance existing program and to also potentially open new spaces. 20 million in emergency housing, 20 million in high acuity shelter, 750K for severe weather, 7.2 million in operating, and then additional incremental changes, 15.4 provider wage, 1.5 a low barrier grant for valuing lived experience, 500K for assisting small BIPOC agencies in participating in regional tables, and 795K for technical assistance for small providers. All told, this would add more than 530 beds to the system, plus 100, so it's like, 530 spaces. So minimum of 400 plus beds, plus through that safe parking work, 130, safe places for people to be. Sarah.
Thanks, Mark. For the just on the left side of the column there, when you say emergency housing, what does that mean exactly?
So after some conversation with the city and the county, we're driving down that line that was established over the course of the pandemic, where we're talking about non-congregate spaces could take a number of different shapes. The slide on this outlines looking at single family, looking at SRO, looking at hotel motel conversion, but non-time limited, housing style options for people.
Okay, thank you. And in terms of the high acuity shelter, I'm assuming that would be congregate?
No, non-congregate. Okay. No more congregate anything.
Okay. And so the 530 beds and spaces. Can you just talk a little bit about that? That's where I was getting caught up in the math. It would seem like to have 530 beds, but only 130 spaces.
Sorry,
There
so
would
the
need-
130 spaces is pulling off safe parking specifically.
I got you. Okay. All
And
right,
then
thank
the
you.
530 beds
Would be individualized units.
mhm,
Thank you.
no problem. I apologize if that's confusing. We'll retool the slide so that it doesn't create that issue. So going into just a little bit of detail, and let me zoom out a little bit here. Safe parking, 5 million, we're looking at 6 to 7 sites, roughly 20 vehicles per site, 130 vehicles at any one time, 195 vehicles served annually. And looking at, what are we getting? Safe and stable spaces for folks who are living in their vehicles. An efficient and effective way of connecting people living in vehicles to services. Vehicle specific services, cannot stress that enough. Like we just don't have like just as an example, sorry, just so that we're very clear on the dearth here. During severe weather incidents, people living in vehicles are at higher risk because many of our severe weather shelters have no parking, right? So like when we're talking about needing to ensure that people have access to, supports during severe weather, we're talking about harm reduction supports for people who are in those kinds of positions. And so the capacity to create vehicle specific services or, add vehicles to sites during severe weather, for example, that's real life-saving stuff. And we really don't have that capacity right now. And then, the outcome that we're looking for is better and quicker service outcomes and, better transitions to stable housing and reduced community and neighborhood impact around vehicular homelessness. I did see Lamont's hand go up and then go down.
No, thanks, Mark. It was related to the community, I think daytime spaces.
Yep.
And I think there was a mention before by some folks with lived experience around the need of having those 24/7 community spaces. I just wanted to relift that.
Yeah, that's my next slide. So we'll thank you. John.
Yes, thanks. Sometimes I don't get the, sometimes I don't get the wording right. When you say no more congregate care shelter, are you talking about emergency shelter that has shared bed space, like dorm bunks, that sort of thing, and we're not going to do that anymore?
So thank you. This is a great question. So there are many shelters that have shared space, but that shared space is structured around like a family or, a couple or, that kind of stuff. That stuff we actually want to do more of, right? So it's not the elimination of shared space. When we say congregate, we're specifically talking about like one large open room and then just either mats on a floor or many bunk beds across that one large open room. What we found very early on in COVID is that those spaces are entirely unsafe at this point, right? Like for folks who are experiencing homelessness and are at extremely high risk for COVID-related complication or fatality, it's just a no-go. The other thing that we've just seen over the years and frankly have not been responsive to is that people experiencing homelessness have said again and again and again, these spaces are unsafe, they don't promote healing, they don't promote dignity, and I would rather stay outside. And they produce not great results, right? So all of that coming together has led us to landing at, for public health reasons and for just like quality of service reasons, that model is the model that we are retiring. Not just all shared space models.
Okay, thank you.
On daytime community space, so we're talking about up to 12 new sites, enhancements to existing sites, and those enhancements, as Lamont mentioned, could be allowing spaces to run 24/7, could be allowing them to, provide more enrichment programming, right? And we're looking for folks to have a place to be, right? And a consistent place for folks to connect to services. We really want to use community centers as our model, right? So like, you know, if I'm drawn to a community center, it's because, you know, there's stuff there that appeals to me. And it doesn't always have to be, you know, focused on, you know, well, how are we getting you enrolled in X, right? Sure, that can happen, but we also want to think about like, how are we providing food? How are we just offering people an opportunity to experience joy? You know, the idea in terms of outcomes would be increased connection to service, expanded geographic service availability, and again, reduced community impact. One of the things that really sticks with me from very early in my career is I remember I was doing work with young people experiencing homelessness. And I remember I was talking to this young person and they said to me, all day long, I am asked to move. Like that is my experience of other people, them asking me to move. And what has stuck with me throughout the, you know, entirety of my career is just that like, that's the reality because we don't actually provide people with spaces to be, right, that are for them. And the winnowing of public space that folks experiencing homelessness are it's deemed acceptable for them to be in is a really unfortunate reality that the nation is currently inside of. And we think we need to create spaces for folks where they are going to be safe and are not going to be asked to leave. John, is your hand up again, or is that from before? I apologize.
I apologize. I forgot to put it down.
No worries. Emergency housing. So this, we've got a lot of flexibility here. We're not locking ourselves into any specific building type, but looking at single family homes, multifamily hotels, conversions, SROs, right? Looking at trying to generate, you know, between 350, 400 beds. This includes money for startup costs, right? So this is not in the staffing of these spaces could be significantly lower annualized, and dedicated resident support staff, right? So the idea, right, is like a dignified place for folks to wait for whatever their permanent housing option is. This is not time limited. And an increased retention of folks as they transition, and again, reduced community impact. What we've noticed, and sort of this is just a quick, again, very simplified system sketch, is that currently, right, like there's nothing between, and we just talked about this, there is nothing between shelter and permanent housing, right? So like you can either choose to wait in shelter or you can go back outside. And that is literally the dichotomous choice. There is not much else, right? And so how we think about emergency housing is that it could sit between those spaces, right? Some people might move directly into emergency housing. I also think, again, we do too much 1, then 2, then 3 in our system, but being clear that like, until we have the housing stock that we need, we cannot just say, again, this ever increasingly Byzantine shelter system and no real opportunity for people to be housed while they are waiting for whatever their permanent option is. So that is the diagnostic and the driver behind the desire to create this, this program type. We'll note, right, that like this is essentially, again, what the county has done, what many, many jurisdictions have done. They've created this type of programming called emergency housing. And I would like our community to do some more policy work and some more definitional work about, you know, how are we structuring this? But we already do have an emergency housing designation. It's in statute at the state level. You know, you can apply for acquisition funds for emergency housing. That's a thing you can already do, right? It's just not necessarily defined in the statute. And I think we should do a little bit more work at the local level. High acuity shelter. This is a focus on about 55 high acuity shelter beds. The cost, right, has to do with that on-site medical and behavioral health staff, right? And just the reality that, like, again, a psychiatric nurse practitioner, that's a lot of money. You know, this is designed to have specialized services to stabilize folks who are in acute need, And right, that this would result in fewer incidents across the system from acute medical or behavioral health episodes, right? And would give us a way to have an intake point, right, for people who are in acute crisis and are living unsheltered and can't just, I mean, we've seen this over and over and over again, right? Like a person in acute crisis goes to a tiny home village and it's not the right placement, right? And again, the problem is not the provider, the problem is the design, and we need to do better for this population of folks. And then severe weather, so $750K for severe weather, countywide funding for heat, smoke, cold, right? Pandemic related, could be used for some shelter expansion, also for harm reduction supplies and other needs. Our goal here is just fewer deaths and injuries, and we really need to understand the significant risk to people's health that severe weather has when they are living unsheltered. And I'm just really concerned we don't have the resources necessary to pull this off in an ongoing way, because we tapped one-time funds in order to do what we did over the winter. We'll probably do that again over the course of the summer for heat and smoke. And then additional operating costs, simple, again, we need more people, faster contract execution, faster and improved provider assistance, better data and performance management work. This would bring our operating costs to 10% of the budget. Most providers aim for 15. HUD targets a 15 to 20% admin rate. So this is not a greedy ad. This is just a, like, let's keep our heads above water ad. So the priority incremental changes, this is a pie chart breaking them down at 67.9 million. The base budget plus priority incremental changes comes to $208 million. Again, that's focused on adding additional places for people. Very briefly, stepping into our additional incremental changes to consider, we have provider wages. So this is 15.4 million for a permanent 13% addition to provider base budgets to increase wages. So the language that we would like to see here around this addition is this money is for wages, right? Like it's not for other stuff, it's for wages. We know there's other stuff that people got to pay for that needs to be dealt with, but this is stepping in the right direction on wages. We're trying to move towards stability in the workforce and address ongoing impact of COVID-19 through inflation and other issues that folks are facing. On lived experience, we want to create a low barrier grant for folks who are trying to center lived expertise in meaningful ways. A lot of folks are trying to do that now. We applaud those efforts, and we want to create a way for them to better center those voices. So the idea would be that you can, write a very simple one-page grant proposal and say, we want to run this affinity group, or we want to partner with the LEC, or we want to whatever, and we would then be able to support that. BIPOC agency participation. So many small BIPOC-led organizations and mutual aid groups are not able to participate in regional planning because they can't afford to. Again, the idea is to have a low barrier, like one-page, application, and then being able to reimburse people for their time participating in sub-regional plans and other work that needs to be reflective of the needs of those organizations and the folks they serve. And then technical assistance for small providers at $795K. So that's, would enable us to provide assistance to up to 53 small providers to get them in an ability or to the point where they would be able to better manage public funds and apply for more funds. So a more diverse population of providers to provide expanding services and expand, right? Like some of those, again, small agencies that are doing really important culturally responsive work so that they're able to take on more clients and really help our system. These additional incremental changes total at about 18.2 million. The bulk of that, again, clearly in the provider wage consideration, that's really important for us. This brings us to the last thing, which is really the total budget with all those additions would be 227 million. With the base and priority incremental changes, again, the 2022 program budget would make up about 52% of that, and then the additions would make up the remainder. So that's 170 million to 227 if we're tracking. And looking at all of those changes, right? What that looks to do is say our base funding in 2022 of 140 million, and then our priority incremental changes, which adds about 28 new projects. This is a really significant addition to our work at 67.9, then additional incremental changes at 18.2 for that total of 247 projects at 227 million. Whew. Meg, anything you would add to talk?
No, Adrian asked in the chat whether the program costs for the new programs were based on increased wages, and yes, the estimates for those new programs were based on higher wages than what's currently in flux. I think the other thing, I saw a question from, somebody was asking about returns to homelessness as a part of the data around those programs. I think we have the data for 2020. The data that's in this presentation is for 2021, and if we can get it, I'd like to just put that in there as well. It's a good suggestion.
Mm-hmm.
That's going way back to the systems analysis, but I've been checking out the chat as we've been going.
CEO Jones.
Board member McHenry.
A lot of information. Glad we're being walked through it and have the opportunity to ask questions. One-time funding is certainly money to be leveraged. And then when we're planning a budget, if it doesn't show up, or if it, then it can be problematic. So I guess I was listening and I may have gotten distracted, which I admit. So the one-time funding that's in here, I think it was 11.4. Are we confident that will be there for the entire budget year, or is there a possibility that it disappears, or is there an assumption that there's some sort of renewal in there? So I just wanted to clarify, not the amount, but just how much can we rely upon that as a core part of this budget, proposed budget.
Okay.
Yeah, so the one-time funding that shows up in the presentation is, we are confident that will roll forward into 23. We are actually, though, and part of, this is the trade-off of presenting pretty detailed numbers this early, is we still are refining what's the actual base that will be a part of, and that's sort of, there's other one-time funds that were a part of the 2022 budget that we want to make sure we understand how much of that may end up becoming ongoing as a part of our base, and we're confirming those, and to have more accurate numbers and final numbers for the presentation of our final budget proposal for the meeting on the 24th.
Yeah. Okay, you answered.
But that 11 is, it's Clipper funding that was allocated for multiple years of a number of programs, and so that will be that we are very confident will be in our budget next year.
What happens? A quick question, then I'll yield the floor. What happens if we approve this budget, or the budget is approved through us and the other body, and then new one-time funding arrives? What's our process for? Do you alert us and seek, a nod, or do you work with the Lived Experience Coalition? I mean, how does that work when we have money that flows in once the budget's been approved in the budget year?
That is an excellent question, and we have no process. And so we need to architect one. I was having this conversation just the other day with the deputy budget director at the city. Like, we just literally have no process for what would be called like a mid-year supplemental, right? Like, and we sure do need one. and additionally, we also, we have no process architected, and need one for you know, there will be NOFAs that drop between now and September that we're going to want to apply for, right? And like, you know, how we incorporate those kinds of things into an ongoing budget discussion and seek authorization and yada, 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 that all that process very much needs to be architected. And we'll be looking to you all for support in that architecture.
Great. So Meg and Mark, so that was a lot of great information. Thank you. Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Meg and the team for all the work that you did to prepare it. Thinking about our next meeting, we'll be asked to make a decision on this. And then after that, it goes to the governing board. I know many of us have gone to the city council or the county council before with budgets. And so I'm anticipating the types of questions they're going to ask you. And so I think it'd be helpful for you to prep them for before our next meeting, which is they're going to wonder what the assumptions are behind the numbers. And so how did you arrive at each of those numbers? They will also likely ask, how would you prioritize in between those categories if all the money doesn't come through? And then I do appreciate Meg saying that she'll get us basically the line item for what is in the existing base budget, because this is it's almost doubling the budget, and we probably need to, you know, have the budget be tenfold, but there will still be a lot of questions about why this budget is proposed to be doubled.
Yeah, and I was taking notes. I think we in an earlier conversation identified that like we just need to do some reconstruction of our internal thinking into digestible external stuff. So like what are assumptions behind the numbers and yada yada yada, and like sort of turn them into cleaner than our internal documents. On the budget stuff, you know, I think what's I agree that this is, you know, it's a hefty ask. And it also, like, you know, we went into this saying and maintain this is not our transformational budget for us, right? Like this is like just about sheer number of people who need assistance, and like we gotta act with some urgency there. And that I think is what's driving our team's analysis of like needing, like looking at like how do we online, you know, 500-ish spaces minimum, right? And so that's what we built around.
And I think that makes total sense, Mark. And also, you know, many people in this community have been saying we are in crisis mode. We need substantial amounts of money for 20 years, and it doesn't come. And I know how the budgets get picked apart each time. And so having you have a great case for need, but there's always questions about, well, what would you give up? What would you change? And so I'm just talking about budget prep, and then inclusion in the budget development process too is always a big question that elected officials will ask.
Yep, understood. Thank you.
I think Damien is next.
And thank you again, Marg and Meg, for your presentation. And I had a comment around something that Gordon had said, but then also just I think because of what Adrian said, it might be helpful, Mark and Meg, if you maybe walked through kind of the pieces that you felt are absolutely necessary. So those priority ones, which have to happen from your perspective. And then on the additional pieces that those you also believe all need to happen, but they're also prioritized and in rank order. And so I think that that's important to note for board members. But then going back to something Gordon mentioned around if there's unanticipated additional revenue or funding sources that come in. And I know that public agencies handle that differently, and sometimes you'll do a mid-year budget adjustment, but also is there the potential for building additional capacity in on the front side, both on the expenditure and the revenue. And then obviously there would be, if something comes in and it needs to come back to the board, it needs to come back to the board, but at least building in some capacity on both sides to account for that, should that happen, rather than having to do a mid-year budget adjustment.
Yes. Yes. Let me caucus with Meg, and then maybe we can talk about it in our next budget committee meeting. I'm also, just so I understand your request, are you asking me to prioritize items now in real time, or would you like that submitted?
No. I going to the additional items that those were, is one of the questions I asked over the last couple of weeks, that those were prioritized.
Yep.
And that you were leading with the need for the increase in terms of compensation there. But you feel all are essential, but that would be the top one if you were forced to pull it away.
That's right. Lamont? Oh no, sorry, Nate, I guess, based on chat.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. And it is like interesting to look back to see what you and the growing team have done as we hit like your 1-year anniversary of you being our first and only employee this time last year too. And while we closed down like our inaugural budget with this board in December and the governing committee in January, we recognized and referenced then it was this lean foundational budget to stand up and to empower you and the growing staff as a bit of a launch pad to take on programs, operations, and building the capacity, both people capacity, as well as the coordination to take us through the remainder of this year, which I think is still relatively very lean and mean in the way that we have it for the rest of 2022. But as also while we're in the midst of transitioning away from 4 rounds of federal COVID relief funding to being a resource for us as our other partners, state and others. And so this is almost kind of like our real inaugural budget in getting to 2023 at this point in the conversation, just a handful of months later. But you know, it is like due to recognizing in terms of the demand of what's needed, as you, Meg, Tiffany have referenced for us here by HUD and McKinsey report and other metrics. The possibilities, as Gordon referenced, on the one-time funding opportunities, like happy for us as budget committee members to kind of support staff in the development of what that structure could look like. But as was also just discussed, that priority 1 or 1A, even though we're going to 2, 3, and A, B, and C, and all the others, I know in talking to you in our budget committee meetings, we want to do all of them. All of them are really essential, right? In terms of how we can get there. We just don't yet have the funds to be able to support us as it currently stands, even though we're still about 2 weeks away from any potential new developments here. But I think there's always a lot that we could continue to do. And the longer we get through that priority list, should one-time funding hopefully be available to us as we get through the rest of this year and early next. And that's really kind of where like you mentioned transformational. I almost look at this as like a foundational plus budget in terms of our financial resources at the moment. And I think slide 35, the way that it sums up the scope for it really well, and in the way that, so thank you for presenting that to us in that regard. You know, it's also just remarkable to look at how this work has been done, even in this past year too, not being fully budgeted in the past, to be able to support some of the programs that are also included here. Like I remember when you all came to give us an update on the severe weather sheltering in December and January, as just one of many examples in the work that you've already been doing, right? And so I think this, you know, I look forward to this 5-year planning exercise and the work that we'll be doing very soon here. But in the meantime, have been pleased by the efficiencies that I've learned that you've shown here with the dollars we're able to put to use. And there's obviously been a lot of great questions and raised in conversations today on a number of different facets that this budget planning process has opened us for us to engage on one another on a board in a meaningful way, honestly. And the 5-year budget process, the kickstart of like 4 other board committee meetings, an upcoming in-person retreat, perhaps, in the first time since we've even been aboard in 2 years' time. I think these are all just key opportunities for us to be more engaged with you, Mark, and staff on the development of our own strategic planning process and the growing efforts in meeting, engaging, and involving our communities and the joint execution of our collective efforts here independently as an authority, as we still stand up and where we are and where we are with our partners. And what's currently been traditionally existing for so long. So I would just say that we're coming to a close to, I know Lamont has a question or comment. We want to make sure we have all these, but appreciate the time that we've had this today. As members of the budget committee in the next 2 weeks, under the leadership of Co-Chair Reddy and Damien as our treasurer, along with the KCRHA staff that are involved, just, very much welcome to addressing my other implementation board members. Any additional thoughts and feedbacks that you all may have for us as we adjourn today and before we reconvene again in 2 weeks' time for a special meeting and hopefully final review and vote on the 24th. But that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Lamont?
Thanks, Sima, and thank you, Mark and Meg, too, for this presentation. It's been really informative. Just 2 quick questions regarding philanthropy or private funds in the overall budget. Like, would we be able to see something that has like information regarding private dollars coming into the overall budget? And then the second piece is regarding the state dollars. I believe there was a significant amount of state funds appropriated towards homelessness. And so how will the state dollars be rolled into all of this? Will some of the state dollars come directly to King County Regional Homeless Authority? So just those thoughts.
The private contribution is quite small and funds, one narrow activity. So I'm happy to layer that in. The state money, just so that there's clarity with everyone, the state money is appropriated, but there's no vehicle for disbursement yet. So like, there's no RFP, there's no, we have no way to apply to draw down money. And as of this moment, have only had preliminary conversation about the timeline on which that might happen, but it's might, right? It is dependent on Commerce as the principal agency, but because of how some stuff is structured through Apple Health and Homes, right? Like, there are some other players who also need to be involved. So we don't know when that money will become available to us, what the application will actually even look like. And so this is another space where, it would be mid-year supplemental stuff, right? Once those NOFAs or RFPs or however they're structured actually are released.
Let's see. So previous funds that came from the state, I think they call them 2060 funding. And so is that funding that goes to the county? Is the county then sending that to
No.
the Regional Homeless Authority? No.
We don't have that funding.
Okay. Do you know if we will be receiving that, or are there plans or anything around that funding?
I'm not aware of anything. Meg, do you know something? I don't.
No, not right now. I wrote down 2060 funding to look into it, but yeah, I'm not aware of any of that coming to the authority at this point.
Thanks. I'd like to share a thought briefly, Mark. Thank you and you and Meg both for putting so much work into this presentation and in the budget itself. I think to Adrian's point, people will look at this and see a large number, without a doubt, right? But at least from my perspective, this feels like catch up. What we see as sort of the priority budget items feel like filling obvious gaps in our system. Gaps that have been clear for years, and we are finally taking the first steps towards addressing them. That second piece, the one about sort of workforce about wages across the system, you pointed to it, Alison Eisinger pointed to it earlier. This is about also playing catch up, right? To bring those wages closer to where we want them to be, and to stabilize this workforce, right? Like, people work hard, and when somebody is experiencing homelessness, you want to make sure that the same person who did outreach to them last time will still be there the next time. That same case manager who knows them and to whom you've opened up is still the same person, 3 months later. This is a lot of work we're asking of this community and in the workforce here. And I hope that we are able to find a way to fund them fully. Those are my brief thoughts, but in our last remaining moments, we've got a few minutes here. Other thoughts from the board? Are there either reflections, comments, questions? And between now and the, our upcoming meeting on May 24th, this was a lot to digest and a lot to think about. I'm going to go and volunteer Mark and Meg for everybody to please reach out to them directly with questions. We want to make sure everybody's questions are answered well and fully. We've got to put a lot of thought into this.
And I mean, I'll just underline that because the experience that we've had with the folks that have been participating on the budget committee has only made this better and stronger. And so very eager to continue that trajectory. I'm just very grateful for Damien and Nate and Simha's time as well. This has felt just incredibly supportive, and I just feel like we are just in a much stronger place because of it.
All right, folks, we're closing in on the 4 o'clock hour. Nate?
Michael, I thought you had something. Did you raise your hand?
Yeah, I'll just comment that I think the budget has enormous integrity to it, and I applaud it, as well as the presentation. And I think that once it's approved, I think that we have some work before us to use it, convey it publicly to the extent possible to help in this process of changing the narrative toward the system change that we all want to see. Often the conversation on homelessness gets, it's reduced to incidents that occur, and that somehow speaks to the entire system. And we have an opportunity before us to use the great work that's done in this budget and what's included in there to help change the narrative and to present a different face toward addressing homelessness in a credible, authoritative way that will really make a difference and who is centered in that process. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to Mark, to Meg, to our community members who spoke at public comment, and the implementation board members. We will see everybody again on May 24th at noon to discuss the budget and make a decision as to whether to forward it on to the governing board. Do I have a motion to adjourn? See a nod from Michael.
Second.
And a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 We're adjourned. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes, and Tiffany Brooks, thank you for all the work you've done on this.
For sure. Yes.